Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe, but you can call me KC, and I gotta tell you, wrapping up my review backlog at this point is feeling pretty great. This video here is a similar story as Chess Story from a couple of weeks ago, where I originally covered The Sandman on Short Story Sundays, discontinued that series actually right after this story's episode in that series, and I felt like the story kind of deserved my regular spoiler-free coverage on account of being more of a novella than a short story, and on account of it actually covering some interesting things and wanting to do so in a less spoilery format. If you know anything about my review formula, let's just kind of jump into things and talk about the good of Chess Story. I want to jump into initially some of the things that I did enjoy about this novella. So the first thing is that I thought the beginning of this novella was very, very engaging. There was an epistolary style to the beginning of the story that was very neat. I think, sort of reminiscent of Frankenstein to a certain degree, where like the first few chapters, the first little bit of it is epistolary and kind of gives you an idea of the tone and some of the things that the story is going to do, but without being the actual story proper, before moving on to something a little bit different. The way that The Sandman reminded me of Frankenstein in that way, I liked, because I love Frankenstein. There's also a lot of early H.P. Lovecraft kind of tone going on in this story, which is pretty good. Evocative imagery, the verbiage, I guess, really sold the vibe for me. The general word choice, or at least I could say the translation that I chose for The Sandman definitely provided all of this for me, because I didn't read this in the original language. I can't do that. Anyway, the point is that of what I read of The Sandman, it was evocative imagery and the verbiage, the general word choice, the style of it, the epistolary format that started the story. All very good stuff. I enjoyed the beginning of the book quite a bit. Probably the most notable aspect of The Sandman, however, is, well, kind of related to the Sandman and how the Sandman is placed, because the Sandman is a figure from folklore. And the way that this story utilizes and twists folklore associated with the Sandman, and kind of a couple of other ideas as well, is interesting. Definitely intriguing way to go about telling a story. As far as I know, the figure of the Sandman within E.T.A. Hoffman's work is relatively unrecognizable from like the normal depictions of that folkloric figure. I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding. So while the twist on folklore and whatnot in the story is cool, it may not necessarily be so representative of what some of the inspiration from the actual folklore is concerned, and maybe that won't work for everybody. At least maybe it won't work for people who are more familiar with it, but maybe that's exactly why some people who are more familiar with that actual folklore might actually enjoy the story, ironically. As for me, at least as far as I could tell, and as far as I was able to research and parse out, the inclusion of the character and the differences from the actual folkloric version seem to really like drive the actual story in its entirety, like why it exists and what it's actually doing. It also constantly flips things on the reader's head, taking some ideas that the reader might be like, okay, I think I know where this is going, and then all of a sudden it's not actually going that direction. It definitely does this several times throughout the narrative. I think that's pretty cool. I enjoyed that, but we'll talk a little bit more about this later. There was also some pretty interesting exploration on the main character's psyche within the novella, not least because it's tied inherently to a lot of the thematic ideas of the story, which are themselves also interesting. There's a lot of exploration here about true humanity, and being able to explore all of that is a great time. Like I said, the way that it explores the main character's psyche in accordance to this and some of the other thematic ideas is pretty solid. As far as thematic ideas themselves are concerned, however, I do want to point out especially the exploration of what the uncanny entails is fantastic in The Sandman. Probably my favorite part of the story, actually, at least so far as more like a building block element of it is concerned, as opposed to an actual portion from the story. I can't really say much on what the uncanny in The Sandman entails without spoiling the whole story, which is part of what I did in the Short Story Sundays version of, covering the Sandman over here. But let's just say that the story was very far ahead of its time in several different ways. The way that perception and reality blend in to all of this coverage is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But I unfortunately didn't love everything about the Sandman, so let's talk about the bad. I wasn't super hot on the narration following the opening of the story. Like, by narration, I mean the actual prose of it, the actual way that the story is told, certain other aspects of the storytelling relating to the main character. Even though I enjoyed exploring the psyche of the main character, there were other aspects of the story that didn't fully work for me after the epistolary format kind of ends in the beginning. I didn't dislike a lot of it, but compared to the opening, I would say a lot of the rest of the story kind of faltered for me. Due to lack of familiarity with the source material as far as folklore is concerned, the folkloric connection didn't really hit for me personally all the way. And on the same note, I found myself confused by much of it. The narration and the narrative itself just never really hit for me in totality. The questions the story raises are pretty vague, kind of unanswerable in a lot of ways, which isn't always the most satisfying. It's not always the most dissatisfying thing either, but it's pretty easy to be dissatisfied in something if that is the case. Not an inherently bad thing, as I said, but there are just a lot of things about the Sandman that I just personally found confusing and hard to really grasp. So, there's that. In addition, I would say that not all of the thematic work of the story really clicked for me either, probably due to certain lack of familiarity with some of the source material and some of the other things going on as well. Though the ideas are interesting, I just kind of had a hard time with a not insignificant chunk of the Sandman. Interpretation of more vague and figurative stuff is not always my strong suit, I admit, particularly in the case of this story specifically. So I just had a hard time with things. Though I love the uncanny elements, a lot of the other thematic stuff kind of felt jarring for me in the long run. As for the ugly, The Sandman is a very rich and thought-provoking story, but I found myself missing a lot of it, like a lot of it, as I kind of already said in the bad. This kind of thing could come down to various different factors. It could come down to translation. It could come down to culture, the timing of when I read the story. Various other things can combine to me not fully clicking with The Sandman. But yeah, I just kind of struggled with a lot of it. I definitely respect this story, but the problem is that I think I respect the story more than I actively like it, which, I wish I could say otherwise. I just wasn't a huge fan. I was a big fan of certain things about it, but as a whole, wasn't fully for me. So when we come down to the recommendation, again, this is another example of kind of hard to say, like really hard to say, and my providing a recommendation in a lot of ways kind of feels wrong. Most of the people I know, for example, who have read The Sandman really, really love this. And since it's so short, just a novella, I think it's totally worth a shot, giving a shot just because of how many people really like it. But it is by absolutely no means a personal favorite of mine, even if it's not a least favorite either. If you're one of those people, however, who loves this story, I would totally love to hear your thoughts. And if you shout those out in the comments below, I'd really appreciate that. I'd honestly really like to know what clicked for you about the story that maybe didn't work for me, or if there's some of the more obvious things that I could have been missing, what those might have been, so that, I might get a firmer grasp on the story. If you check out the Short Story Sundays version of The Sandman, my coverage on that there, comment in that video some of the things that I'm probably missing, because I actually go a little bit more into depth, like spoiler talk ways, actually discussing some of the things, like, yeah, some of this stuff didn't really make sense to me, or there's some things going on here, but I'm not entirely sure what actually happened, that kind of thing. So if you want to check out that video and shout out your comments as to some of the things that I'm more confused by, if there's simple explanations for some of that, I would love to hear that in those comments on that video. Either way, I really appreciate you guys for watching this. There's just one more review left coming this month before I'm done with my review backlog effectively, at least at the time that I'm recording this video. That final, backup review will be happening on Thursday. But first, because today's Sunday and I still have a Tuesday episode of the Book Binge to get through, I am excited to get into something a little bit fresher for that review first. I'll be reviewing The Dead Zone by Stephen King on Tuesday. Long time coming for me actually reading that book. Also, God help me at this point, as Overhaul is still not done yet with this videos coming out. That's crazy work schedule stuff that's probably leaving me incredibly exhausted. I'm recording this before Overhaul, obviously, but hopefully I'm still doing fine at this point by the time the video releases. Thank you guys once again for watching. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.